Hey Zilly, this is a SuperZOMGBBQ, and today we're going to talk about the top cards in WrestleMania tier. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while, and actually, to be honest with you, I was planning and actually did make part of the video for Survivor and Legendary tier, but I felt that it wasn't the time at that point to make the video. Now is the perfect time because a lot of people have now got into WrestleMania tier, not just the guys at the beginning, so you guys can know exactly who the best cards are, which cards you should be aiming for, especially when you're going for events, especially when you're getting awards from King of the Rings, and also when you're going for team events as well. Which cards rank up there with the best and which cards are kind of not so good. What we're going to do is cover off the top 10, yes, top 10 cards in WrestleMania tier for the superstars, and also for the divas. We're going to do the top 5. We're also going to do the bottom 10 worst cards and the bottom 5 worst divas as well in the tier for you, and those are going to be in a different video. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking about those top 10 worst cards in WrestleMania tier. Is we're going to work our way from the best of the worst, if that makes any sense, down to the worst card in the tier. That should come as no surprise what the worst card is, but let's go into it anyway. Disclosure is that sometimes the top 10 or the worst 10 are not always a perfect 10. You could potentially have 12 or 11 in that, because there are some cards that are exactly the same stat points, so you have to class those being the same rank. We're still going to do a top 10 though, which is good. You also might be seeing on the left hand side of the screen there an Apollo Crews card. That's a brand new card, and we're hoping and expecting maybe to be some kind of cards coming to the tier in the future. I can't wait. So let's talk about those worst cards, and the first ones to come to are Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley. Now they set up the top as the 10th worst as such, and that's because they roughly have around about the same stats. They've got the same speed as far as I'm aware, and their stats are effectively almost exactly the same. There's not much of a difference there, but Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley are not necessarily the worst, because Bubba Ray, for example, is very, very, very useful in charisma. There's not a lot of charisma cards or power and charisma cards at the bottom of the tier, so that is a very, very, very useful card, especially if it procs. And if you do actually put most of the tokens in charisma, it can actually be a really useful card. Devon, unfortunately, there's a lot of cards in Season 2 that do proc in power and toughness, so he does kind of get forgotten about, but them two as a tag is still quite good. Moving on from that, we also have Stardust, and Stardust as a card is not one of the best. However, he does proc in speed and charisma, which is when you fire off an ability, and as that goes, you know, that's useful in the lower tiers, but still one of the weaker cards going on. The next one is actually a card that was in the most recent Ring Domination, which is Adrian Neville. Now, Adrian Neville, whilst he's one of the better cards in power and speed, and one of the only cards that goes in power and speed, does have a massive, massive weakness, which is, if I can get to Neville quickly, then he just basically his toughness and his speed is incredibly low. It's shockingly low, in fairness. And one of the things you will cover off is some of the worst stats in the tier as well, which is another thing which we're going to look through as well whilst we're doing this video. So let's move on to the next one, which is Mark Hemery. Again, this is a list going downwards. Now, Mark Hemery's actually got some impressive power compared to some other cards, like, for example, Big Show. But obviously, his speed is going to let him down. His charisma isn't the best, and he's not got the best toughness either. So, you know, as a power card, he's actually not that bad. And he's a good down arrow. That's another thing. Another thing about Neville as well is he's a down arrow. Down arrows are rare in SuperCard because of the way that they've done the tier assaulting of the arrows in the game. Up there, for example, up arrows, there are plenty of them. There's not many good down arrows, for example, the elitist one being, of course, Stone Cold Steve Austin and Kevin Owens as an example. Now, one other one to actually mention there is actually Alberto Del Rio. Alberto Del Rio is actually one of the strongest down arrows in the game. He's not in the top 10, but he's pretty close. And the next one to talk about is Goldust. Goldust, actually, you know what? This card is really useful. I'm surprised he's in the bottom. I'm just going to show you that it's the pro animation here. But actually, if you look at his stats, his overall toughness is actually really useful. There's not many cards that actually proc in toughness and charisma, and I found him really useful. The problem with Goldust is, unfortunately, his power is absolutely shocking. So that's what really brings him down. And compared to the other cards, if you level him up in toughness, he's one of the toughest cards in the game, and he very rarely gets 4-statted by a card, which obviously cards like Devon Dudley, for example, can get 4-statted by a card easy. 4-statted, by the way, means where you your card loses in all 4 stats. You get 3-statting as well, which is another thing that's very, very similar. Next one is Titus O'Neill. Titus O'Neill, unfortunately, has been let down by his speed. Let's just move on from that, because Titus O'Neill brings back a couple of points. Braun Strowman is the next one. Now, I'm not sure if anyone was really surprised by this, but the final 4 of the top 10 worst cards in WWE SuperCard for WrestleMania tier does include 3 members of the Wyatt family. They've not been well represented in the game, but Braun Strowman does have not just the speed but the charisma of a carrot, it seems. So anyway, let's move on. Big Show let down again by just poor stats, and for the first time that he's in WWE SuperCard in a big tier since, well, basically legendary tier in season 1, he's not got very good stats to show for it. Me personally, I was hoping he'd have like really awesome toughness or power, but alas, that's the case. Luke Harper is the next one. Luke Harper is a card that I unfortunately do have. If I go to Luke Harper, let's find it. Luke Harper is around here somewhere. Here he is, and he is just let down by overall poor stats. And the last one, the worst card of the tier, is Erick Rowan. Erick Rowan, purely because, let's be honest, what does he actually do? He also is the guy who lost in 6 seconds to The Rock at WrestleMania 32. So that's not a great accolade to have. Now, whilst we're there, let's also look at some of the worst stats, period, for cards in this tier. And WrestleMania tier obviously comes some pretty incredible stats, but there's also some really bad stats. So I'm actually going to have a look at some of the worst stats in the game, and we're going to go through this. Is going to be a theme between now and the Divas section, which I'm going to go through another time, and this is through research that I've done myself. Now, you might be surprised to hear that one of the people who has the worst stat for toughness in the game isn't actually in this bottom 10, and that's going to be a theme. There's actually a couple of these in this game, which does give a lot of variety, so it's not just the best cards getting some of the best stats. So for the worst power, it is Goldust, as I mentioned earlier on. For the worst toughness, it's actually the Miz, fair enough. Although Miz is actually quite a useful card in WrestleMania, especially the fact he does proc or ability in power and charisma. Titus O'Neill has the worst speed, as I told you earlier, it's absolutely shocking. And Erick Rowan, the card we just mentioned, who's the worst card in tier, does have the worst charisma. But it's important to mention that up front, because there's a couple of these cards that do tie on stats overall, and these are going to be what they end up as the finished product. So let's first of all talk about number 10. Okay, number 10 is actually Daniel Bryan, and he does have a pretty awesome card that goes along with it. You get that super token as well, it goes along, really, really sweet. But the main issue with Daniel Bryan is that whilst there are about 11 cards better than him, because some of the cards at the top of the tier are actually equal statted even when they're fully pro'd, he does make the list at number 10. Just underneath him, just to give him the shout out, is Macho Man Randy Savage, just in case any of you were wondering, but very, very similar cards. Sting then makes up number 9. Now, Sting is actually a very good card compared to the last tier. He's actually very, very good and very useful in power and also in charisma. He's maybe not as good as maybe John Cena in that, but you do have the opportunity, for example, like I did with my Sting, to level him fully in power and just throw everything in power and let the rest kind of take care of itself. It does make a big, big, big difference. But he is a very, very useful card and a good left arrow to have, especially if you've got the likes of Sami Zayn, which is the most recent event card in the game, and also future event cards going forward. The next one is Dean Ambrose. Now, Dean Ambrose has, well, he's got one of the best options of potentially free statting the mighty Brock Lesnar, who is later on this list. And basically he is an absolute demon and one of the only cards in the tier that procs in toughness, or has the ability in toughness and speed. His stats are pretty awesome. He does get crushed by a couple of other cards lower down in the tier, which is important to mention. It's crazy how much cards like Rollins and Reigns can have an effect on Dean Ambrose as a card in terms of the overall stats, but as a card, if you wanted to go up against the likes of Brock Lesnar, Triple H, there's plenty of others I can mention. He is an absolute machine and a very, very good pro if you've got one. The next one just above that is Seth Rollins and Shawn Michaels together. Now the impact of this is very, very, very significant, because Seth Rollins also shares the greatest speed stat with two other superstars in the tier, and you'll be surprised which ones he actually shares those with. But Seth Rollins and Shawn Michaels are effectively the same card. You just take away the speed element and the charisma element and you just switch them across. So for example, Seth Rollins is the best, one of the best cards in speed in the game, whereas Shawn Michaels is one of the best charisma cards in the game. He's not the best because that belongs to another superstar. However, where he does benefit is that he is better in charisma than Seth Rollins and doesn't have the same level of speed, so they are exactly the same stats otherwise. But both incredible cards, and interestingly enough, something which you should know if you haven't played or got this card yet is that Shawn Michaels has now turned into a very, very useful up arrow, which can make a huge difference. Moving on to number 6 though is good old Johnny Boy, John Cena, who is a machine in power and charisma. Not the best, and there is one other card which we're going to be speaking about which is better almost in 4 stats to him. But he is a very, very useful card, and if you level him up right, especially the power, and you've got the ability potentially with John to do toughness and charisma, he's actually a very, very useful card and one of the best right arrows, if not I believe the best right arrow in the tier, which makes him incredibly useful. Moving at number 5 is Roman Reigns, a card I actually have a pro of, and a few people have a pro because he was in the most recent Road to Glory event, which had Andre the Giant in it. If we go to Roman Reigns now, I'll show you why he's one of the best, because he's got some of the best stats, and he's actually very useful for taking on cards such as The Undertaker, Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock. He's very much an anti-card. He can be good in pretty much every stat. He's not so great in speed. If you level him up in speed a bit more, he can be great, and he's a great card to go up against anyone, but particularly not so great against Brock Lesnar. Let's just put it that way. At number 4 is Triple H. Triple H is an absolute machine. His stats are very similar to John Cena. However, you have to flip effectively the power and charisma around, but he does seem to benefit more from some of the stats he's got. It's actually interesting to see a Triple H actually better card than Roman Reigns overall, which is a very interesting thing. Moving on then to number 3, so we're going to get the last 3 cards, which are going to be, first of all, start off with Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar is an absolute demon, and it seems like as a card, his only real weakness is the fact that he doesn't have a huge amount of charisma, but against some of the cards like Taker, Austin, he can be an absolute machine, and you just left his toughness alone and did the other 3 stats, you would pretty much be a monster. The one card he does have a significant issue against, however, is Dean Ambrose, but as a card, his power is the best in the tier, unrivaled or anything else, which makes it a huge, huge difference. So very similar to how Shawn Michaels and Seth Rollins worked out earlier on, we have The Undertaker and The Rock. I don't have The Rock card, but I'll be popping up on the screen in a second. We have The Undertaker though, and mainly because they have exactly the same stats, even when fully leveled, they have exactly the same stat points, which is crazy. But this Undertaker also has the benefit of being one of the best cards in toughness as well, has a decent amount of charisma, and you see I mentioned earlier on Brock Lesnar suffering in toughness and charisma. That is one of the reasons why over here. The Rock does have the best charisma in the tier though, which is obviously again a massive, massive benefit. And number 1, and this one came as a surprise because I personally was under the impression that The Undertaker was the best card, but after leveling up fully with the best benefits he's got in the game and the best stats he's got in the game, we have Stone Cold Steve Austin, who is the number 1 best card in WrestleMania tier minus the event cards, and that's mainly because he has a huge amount of toughness, a good amount of power, and a good amount of charisma as well to go over decent-ish speed. but he is an absolute monster. Probably not the best in terms of what you can do with him, but as an overall card, he is a machine. So, taking that all away, let's look at the best cards in the tier for certain stats. You may have already noticed earlier on I said about the best power. Best power as Brock Lesnar, I mentioned it earlier on. Best toughness is actually the Undertaker. Best speed is actually shared with one card from the top 10 and another 2 cards outside the top 10. Best speed, as I mentioned, Rollins has one of them. He's actually tied with 2 other people in the tier who are actually mid-tier, which is AJ Styles and Edge. And AJ Styles and Edge, here's a little tidbit or a fact find for you, are actually exactly the same stats in exactly the same parts. So power, speed, toughness, charisma, they're exactly the same stats for those cards. The last one is charisma, which does go to The Rock, who does have the highest amount of charisma in the game. But then again, that's very much the same as it was in Legendary tier, in Epic tier, and also in Survivor tier. But that's it from me. Let me know what you thought about this and whether this is something I should do for other tiers in the comment section below. Let me know if you got one of the best cards or worst cards in the tier. There's plenty of people who got some of the worst and best. And if you got any of those top stats in WrestleMania tier. Divas is coming up in another episode. I actually will link it up here. It should be just popping up on the left hand side or right hand side. I keep getting that part wrong. And details in the description below for that video as well when it comes up. If you can do 5 things for me in this video, it'd be great. Things I've mentioned in every single one of my videos. First of all, it is to like this video, share it on, because obviously this is something that most people would want to know about. We're having the best cards, worst cards in the tier, especially if you just got your pull or got a couple of freebies. This is a great way of knowing if your card is one of the best or worst in the tier, unfortunately. Then the next thing to do, subscribe to the channel for more WWE SuperCard. Anything you want to see might just be there, so subscribe to the channel and you might be able to see some more. Also then, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and also Twitch, and I'll see you guys very, very soon. Sorry!